This course contains recitations of the Quran in a secular context.
When I teach my seminar on Islam, at some point in the middle of the semester, a couple of students will invariably ask, "When are we going to talk about the 5 pillars of Islam?" It's not an unreasonable question. After all, in this course we've already discussed pre-Islamic history, the revelation to Muhammad, and the collation of it into the Quran, the primary themes and characters in the text. But it's fair to ask, how does any of this translate into practice? How is the Quran used as a model for Muslim life and behavior? When my students ask, I typically reply, "Oh yes, those. Can you find them for me in the Quran?" I get a few puzzled looks, and then students say, "Well, it talks a lot about prayer and giving money to the poor, and about God." Yes, all true. But are there any pillars in the Quran? How often do you have to pray? How long do you fast for? What do you do on the Hajj? As it happens, none of these questions are answered in the Quran. But it's also the case that the 5 pillars are a mainstay in descriptions of Islam and a succinct summary of the Muslim community's ritual practices. The question is, how did these customs develop out of the Quran? Especially when some rituals are elaborate and prescriptive, but only sparsely described in the text. For example, while we are exhorted to pray repeatedly, the Quran never tells us how or how often. To answer these sorts of questions, the early followers of Muhammad imitated his practice, and the record of these practices comes to be called the Sunnah, what we might literally understand as the practice of the community. These practices are often contained in a different body of literature, the Hadith, that has come to assume an authoritative position second only to the Quran in terms of textual guidance for believers. Even with this, however, questions invariably arise. The process of interpretation of the Quran and Hadith together with other authoritative sources is called ijtihad. In this lecture, we will explore the process of ijtihad in reference to the 5 pillars, illustrating how the Quranic text comes to be supplemented with a variety of sources. Sunnah, Hadith, and ijtihad need a brief introduction before we dive into the 5 pillars themselves, and I'll address each in turn. As I said, the Sunnah is rather simply the practice or tradition of the community. In this case, meaning the community of believers in both Mecca and Medina, as well as the example of the Prophet himself. For instance, as I said, while the Quran repeatedly prescribes prayer, how to pray is never explained in the text. Helpfully, for both us and the believers, Muhammad regularly prayed, and his followers learned the ritual practice of prayer from him. This kind of rote education became the sorts of details the community, called the Ummah, would pass along from believer to believer. As Muhammad's message spread, the community closest to the Prophet obviously could not attend to or control in person all the necessary information needed to instruct new believers in proper piety. As the needs for instruction grew, so did the body of literature in which the Sunnah was contained, the Hadith. Hadith is an important and complicated part of the broader story of Islam. This includes some technical concerns that I can only mention in passing. For example, the Hadith tends to record sayings or actions of the Prophet, and sometimes those of his closest companions, but it is not exhaustive of the collective activity of the earlier followers. So something can be part of the Sunnah without having a precisely corresponding Hadith. I realize this is somewhat confusing given what I've just said. While there is great overlap between Sunnah and Hadith, some parts of the community practice are understood as a consensus activity based upon the Quran, Hadith, or tradition. It's what believers do. Hadith is primarily a record of the words and deeds of Prophet Muhammad and can thus clarify and explain Sunnah, but is not constitutive of the whole Sunnah. We can think of Hadith as a kind of history of the earliest moments in the formation of the Islamic tradition, but something that entails more debate and argument than practice itself. In terms of length, the Hadith literature vastly outnumbers the Quran in number of words, and is, as I just said, interpretively a much more contentious affair. While some limited Hadith is broadly accepted in the global Islamic community, much of it is subject to great dispute. These disputes can range from the technical to the theological. We'll discuss the Hadith in more detail in this lecture and others, but the main takeaway is that this body of literature is the established record of the Prophet Muhammad's words and deeds, and thus serves as the most authoritative interpretation of the Quran. If someone came to Muhammad for guidance or in search of clarity about a particular verse, what Muhammad is reported to have said would obviously become the mechanism by which that part of the Quran is understood. You might well imagine how disputes over the authenticity of Hadith might then lead to disagreements over how the Quran itself is interpreted. And interpretation itself is our next subject. Ijtihad, as with so much in this course, has a long and complex history. When questions about the Quran require reference to the Sunnah or Hadith, or some combination of text and reasoning, we are then firmly in the realm of ijtihad, which can be translated as the struggle to understand. In order to know how to be a Muslim, it's necessary to engage in ijtihad, combining the authoritative source text with other records, communal practices, and philosophical reflections to arrive at a detailed picture of Islamic practice. One element of this interpretive tradition is called tafsir, the careful reading of the Quran and Hadith, often entailing highly technical analysis of lexical, linguistic, and theological elements of the text. Our main takeaway should be that the practice of Islam does not arise full cloth from the Quran alone, but is rather a combination and accumulation of traditions and interpretations. In this sense, ijtihad is a constantly evolving phenomenon. As new questions and issues arise, the community returns to these texts and traditions to find answers to everyday questions. So, when combined, Al-Quran, Sunnah, Hadith, and Ijtihad provide the general parameters for the ritual practices that create Islamic identity. This is not to say there isn't still debate about these practices, but the broad outlines of communal tradition become apparent, what we can technically call orthopraxy, or right practice, for the majority of Muslims. Since the focus of our course is the Quran itself, let's examine how the Quran presents the foundational elements of orthopraxy and highlight where Sunnah, Hadith, and Ijtihad are necessary for completing the picture. As we'll see, it took perhaps 200 years for these traditions to develop into the form we have them today, but each one has clear roots in the Quran itself. Commonly called the Statement of Faith, the Shahada is a two-part proclamation that signals one's adherence to the central tenet of Islamic identity. La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadun Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. This phrase is said over both the newborn infant and the dying, and is the statement a convert attests to in front of witnesses. It is ultimately what makes a Muslim a Muslim. The Shahada, however, appears nowhere in the Quran, at least in this form. What we do have in the text, however, are numerous passages or phrases similar to this passage from Surah 112. Say, He is God the One, God the Eternal. He begot no one, nor was He begotten. No one is comparable to him. The assertion of God's oneness, tawheed, is something we've seen repeatedly emphasized in the text, and is indeed one of the primary rhetorical concerns of the Quran. Over and against the polytheism assumed of the pre-Islamic Arab tribes, the unequivocal monotheism of the Quran is perhaps its defining feature. Surah 112's insistence that God is not begotten also implies that the Christian tripartite God is rejected. The second half of the Shahada, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, is likewise found littered throughout the Quran. For example, Surah 4, verse 170 reads, "People, the messenger has come to you with the truth from your Lord, so believe. That is best for you. For even if you disbelieve, all that is in the heavens and the earth still belongs to God. God has the knowledge to decide." The word translated here as messenger is Rasul, the same term used for Muhammad in the Shahada, and it has a rather particular connotation. As Roberto Totoli describes it, apart from Muhammad himself, this term is only employed in direct connection with Noah, Ishmael, Moses, Lot, Jesus, and with the Arabian messengers Hud, Saleh, and Shu'aib. That is, no other biblical prophet is referred to as a messenger in the Quran. Other figures, Abraham, David, Solomon, are referred to as Nabi, translated as prophet, a term also used for Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. The precise distinction between messengers and prophets is not clearly elucidated in the Quran, although there is a suggestion that God's messengers deserve personal obedience in ways not required or expected of prophets. In this sense, a messenger, Rasul, is marginally superior to a mere prophet. Regardless of the distinction, Muhammad is clearly both prophet and messenger. The formulation of the Shahada then, which foregrounds God's oneness and Muhammad as messenger, is deeply rooted in the Quran, if not literally stated there. Different iterations of the phrase, however, can be found on coins from the 9th and 10th centuries and came to be widely accepted as a ritual assertion, perhaps in the 11th century. After the assertion of faith, prayer is the most regular, visible religious activity in the Islamic tradition. And as you might expect, it's mentioned numerous times throughout the Quran. Most of these occurrences, however, are in a rather general sense, akin to God observing rhetorically, "You pray to your Lord," or in describing the activities of earlier prophets, such as when Abraham prayed. In a few passages, however, there is discussion of both the times of prayer and what we might call the ritual purity required to perform the prayer. Surah 17, for example, discusses prayer as a regular, recurring activity. So perform the regular prayers in the period from the time the sun is past its zenith till the darkness of the night. And recite the Quran at dawn. Dawn recitation is always witnessed. And during the night, wake up and pray as an extra offering of your own, so that your Lord may raise you to a praised status. Surah 62 also makes mention of what sounds like a particular day of prayer. Believers, when the call to prayer is made on the day of congregation, hurry towards the reminder of God and leave off your trading. That is better for you, if only you knew. Despite this, the Quran is silent on when this day of congregation is, nor does it spell out explicitly the number of daily prayers. Both of these are left to the Sunnah and Hadith. The setting of 5 daily prayers comes, in fact, from perhaps the most famous extra-Quranic story about Muhammad's life, the night journey to heaven, or Miraj. The story is too wonderfully detailed to recount here in full, but it's worth taking some time to illuminate its contours. After all, it serves not only to tell how Muhammad was given visions of the afterlife, as I discussed in a previous lesson, but also to explicitly establish Jerusalem as a central location for Islamic religiosity. The basic idea is that Muhammad is said to have been transported at night to Jerusalem upon the magical beast Buraq. He alights atop the ruins of the Temple Mount, where today resides the Dome of the Rock. From here, Muhammad ascends a ladder to heaven. Along the way, Muhammad meets numerous biblical prophets who affirm his prophethood, and he is then given a brief audience with God. During this meeting with God, Muhammad and his community are assigned 50 daily prayers. As Muhammad descends from the highest plane with these instructions, it's recounted that he is asked by Moses what he has been told about prayer. Aghast at the number of prayers assigned to Muhammad's community, Moses says he knows from experience that people cannot sustain this. Moses instructs Muhammad to return and beg for fewer, lest his followers resist the instruction. Muhammad does so, and the drama repeats itself until Muhammad has negotiated just 5 daily prayers. Moses once again encourages Muhammad to return again and ask for fewer, but Muhammad is said to have replied, "I have begged so much of my sustainer that I feel ashamed, but I am content now, and I shall submit." While this is not the whole story of Muhammad's journey and ascension, we can clearly see how the tale, part of the classical biography of Muhammad, informs the interpretive tradition of both the Quran and the Hadith. This story is contained, among other places, in al-Bukhari's The Authentic Collection, a compendium of Hadith related to the life of the Prophet, composed sometime in the mid-9th century. While the rest of the story of Muhammad's night journey and ascension must wait for another time, for our purposes it is a perfect example of how hints from the Quran are combined with accounts in the Hadith to textually affirm the specifics of ritual practice. It's entirely possible that the 5 prayers were already well established during Muhammad's lifetime, but the correspondence with this Hadith account adds additional legitimacy to the ritual practice, despite, or perhaps even because of, the fantastic nature of the story. One noteworthy feature of the Quran is its concern for charity, especially the upkeep of orphans and widows. In a world where both might easily have been cast aside, the Quran centers our attention on these social outliers and commands that they receive largesse from the community. As Surah 2 describes it, believers must keep up the prayer and give out of what we have provided for them. This charitable giving is called zakat and becomes an important, if exceedingly vague, concept. Later in Surah 2, we're enjoined to keep up the prayer, pay the prescribed alms, zakat, and bow down to God with those who bow. What exactly is prescribed, however, is never explicitly revealed. Other passages in the Quran and numerous passages from the Hadith suggest various things that are subject to taxation for the purposes of charity. They include a variety of different, though not all, livestock, certain agricultural products, especially those that are storable, precious metals, particularly if they are coins, material mined from the earth, and treasure, including booty from war. In some instances, zakat is owed on a yearly basis, and sometimes at the moment of acquisition, such as with mining. Legal scholars subsequently had a heyday enumerating categories of taxable goods, their various rates, and when the tax should be assessed. Furthermore, there is the question of who should collect the tax. Is it a governmental concern, or is this charity freely given in addition to ordinary civil taxes? Much of the traditional debate negotiated over items that strike us today as archaic. How to categorize camels and horses relative to other livestock, or whether copper and tin were of a category analogous to gold and silver. Most of these debates have receded into history. Instead, Many Muslims simply set aside 2.5% of their income or worth and donate it to charitable groups every year. This regular act of piety has become the de facto response to the technically obscure but morally clear commandment, "Give out of what we have provided for you before death comes to one of you, and he says, 'My Lord, if you would only reprieve me for a little while, I would give in charity and become one of the righteous.'" God does not reprieve a soul when its turn comes. God is fully aware of what you do. As with so many other components of the text, it remains an interesting and telling feature that modern interpretation often resorts to this sort of technically precise rendering of an ambiguous textual instruction. The most physically demanding ritual in the Islamic tradition is fasting during the month of Ramadan. We'll look at the Quranic passages specifically related to this in a moment, but there are two things first worth noting. First, abstaining from food or other necessities and pleasures is not unique to Islam, as you probably already know. Indeed, various forms of fasting are familiar from any number of other religious traditions. In this sense, the Quranic injunction to fast is a common practice. Second, most of the passages related to fasting suggest that it should be done as penance for some sin or moral failing. For example, Surah 5 says that the atonement for breaking an oath is to feed 10 poor people with food equivalent to what you would normally give your own families, or to clothe them, or to set free a slave. If a person cannot find the means, he should fast for 3 days. There are a number of other similar pronouncements of fasting as a kind of punishment for wrongdoing. Where then does the fast, Saum in Arabic, during the month of Ramadan come from, and how is it observed? Relative to the other pillars, the fast is given fairly detailed description in Surah 2, where it's declared that fasting will occur from sunrise to sunset during the month of Ramadan, the 9th month in the Islamic lunar calendar, because this was the month when the Quran was first revealed. This Quranic rationale had another appeal. As Islamic historian Carol Hillenbrand says, at a purely practical level, when he was setting up his community of Muslims in Medina, Muhammad's choice of Ramadan for the month of fasting was astute and far-sighted. This month was one of the pre-Islamic months of truce, when warring tribesmen would lay down their arms. In this way, fasting as an opportunity to reflect on God's generosity and the trials of the less fortunate corresponded with an already established time of peace and contemplation. For the fast itself, eating, drinking, and sexual intercourse, what we can reasonably read as general physical pleasure, are allowed during the night, but must cease once the thread of dawn is visible on the horizon. Allowances are made for those ill, pregnant, nursing, or traveling, and one can exchange fasting with additional charity or fasting on different days if necessary. As the guidelines to fasting are so clearly delineated in the Quran, there is very little interpretation necessary for this pillar. Obviously, the festive post-fast meals and lengthy additional prayers are additions, some of which are drawn from the Hadith, but the practice itself is clear in the Quranic text. Of the additions, there is one that is almost quaint in its observation, but is a universal favorite. A Hadith tells that Muhammad preferred to break his own fast by eating a date, and so to this day, many Muslims follow his example by eating dates before moving on to a larger meal. Visually arresting, and today a huge logistical challenge, the Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, is the last of the 5 pillars. In many ways, this is the most complicated of the pillars and has a combination of pre-Islamic, Quranic, and post-Quranic elements to it. We won't explore the Hajj itself in great detail, but it's valuable to know what the Quran has to say about the practice. While only mentioned some 14 times throughout the whole of the Quran, the context of many of these verses suggest that the contours and traditions of the pilgrimage were well known to the Quran's early audience. And indeed, as we've seen, it was pilgrimage to the Kaaba in Mecca that had made this Arabian town a central place of religious activity during pre-Islamic times. Thus, when the Quran references the pilgrimage, its general parameters and significance would have already been known. One key difference, and something we saw in an earlier lecture, is that the Quran reclaims the Kaaba from the house of idols it was during the early 7th century, recasting it as having been originally built by Abraham and his son Ishmael. By doing this, the Quran establishes that the Kaaba itself and many of the rituals that attend to the Hajj were initiated by Abraham and Ishmael's mother Hagar, and as such are simply a return to their original monotheistic intent. So when Surah 22 commands, "Then let the pilgrims perform their acts of cleansing, fulfill their vows, and circle around the ancient house," the intent and context of this instruction would have been clear. The integration of ancient practice with a new perspective is made even more explicit in Surah 2. Safa and Marwa are among the rights of God. So for those who make major or minor pilgrimage to the house, it is no offense to circulate between the two. Safa and Marwa are two hills near Mecca, between which it was said Hagar ran in search of water for her infant Ishmael. This verse seems to assure pilgrims that this act, ostensibly practiced by the pagans, was likewise of monotheistic origin. In this way, the Quran fuses together pre-Islamic ritual practice with a thoroughly Abrahamic interpretive scheme. Multiple accounts of Islamic history tell of Muhammad's own pilgrimages to Mecca in the years before his death. That evidence, combined with the established customs, became the foundation for the Hajj as we know it today. As with all the other pillars, the details of this ritual practice are left vague in the Quran, but especially in the case of the Hajj, there is a clear and well-known established custom to which would-be pilgrims could refer for their own practice. While the 5 pillars do not exist as such in the Quran, I hope it's evident how each one is firmly rooted in clear textual injunction. The organization of these acts into official orthopraxis, however, requires going beyond the text of the Quran, relying upon the tradition of the Prophet and his companions, as well as interpretive exercises by successive communities. The Quran as a text builds a foundation for a community, and as we see in other religious traditions, no one text is exhaustive in explanation and detail. The living out of a religious tradition relies upon the efforts of humans to elaborate and interpret how a sacred text becomes practically exercised. In other words, it's ijtihad. And so, as I hope is clear, the ways in which the Quran is read and interpreted to create Islamic tradition rely upon a rich practice of text and tradition. As we'll see in my next lecture, this kind of interpretive activity can take us to exciting and sometimes dangerous territory.